All right. Well, I want to make another episode tonight. I haven't had as much time as to prepare as I would like, but I kind of have an idea of what I want to talk about. So the big thing that I want to talk about is the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin. Um, Interesting stuff. I listened to the whole interview. It's a little more than 2 hours long. A lot of good material in there. I'd highly recommend checking it out and listening to it for yourself. I don't think it'll change the current state of geopolitics very much, but I think this is an interesting opportunity to kind of hear what the Russian case on this whole Ukraine war thing is. Whether you agree with it or not, that's entirely up to you. So, anyhow, moving on. I wanted to kind of review some of the claims that have been going on in the media or in the mainstream media. I just did a simple Google search of what was going on of the Tucker Carlson interview. So we'll start with this one from the New Yorker. No, I don't want to pay. So, Tucker Carlson promised an unedited Putin. The result was boring. Well, yeah, it was kind of boring. So, I would say, first off, based off the claim in this title, we'll read some of the article. But first off, this claim in the title, Putin treated very much as you might say a podcast, I guess you can say. I'm not sure what he was expecting. It was a 2 hour long interview, sure. A lot of it, like the first 30 minutes, was just Putin essentially talking about Russian history, or the history of Russia as it relates to Ukraine, what their relationship is, and why he thinks that the lands are Russian, and why it is that basically attacked Ukraine more recently. No thanks, I don't want to pay. Alright, so let's go ahead and read. On February 6th, Tucker Carlson spent more than 2 hours interviewing Vladimir Putin. The interview later aired in a version dubbed by what would appear to be Kremlin-provided translators on Carlson's website, one of Russia's main state television channels, and the Kremlin website. Alright, so I will say it might be the fault of the translators. It might be part of the cultural differences or language differences between English and Russian. Point is, Putin comes off as kind of an arrogant guy. I'm gonna avoid saying things that are a little bit more impolite, but we'll just say that he comes off as kind of arrogant. It could be the fault of the translator. I don't speak Russian, so kind of at the mercy of that. Anyhow, moving on. What Tucker Carlson saw when he interviewed Putin, more than anything else, Carlson seemed surprised by the fact that he got to interview Putin in the Kremlin and even film himself sharing some post-interview impressions in a room full of lacquer and gold leaf by what Putin said during the interview and by the man himself. Putin used the interview to deliver a lengthy lecture on the history of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and its aftermath, meant to convince viewers that Ukraine never had a right to exist. That's kind of broadly skimming over it. Again, this is the problem with mainstream media. They kind of frame things in the wrong way. It's not that Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist. He said that multiple times in the interview that, all right, fine, you don't want to be Russia. That's your deal. But he's also stated on numerous occasions about how he feels a threat from NATO and why he thinks that these lands are Russian, and basically he wants denazification of Ukraine. He made lots of arguments around that. Again, this is the typical framing in uncharitable light that you can expect from the mainstream media. Moving on. When he was done with the lecture, he segued into a litany of grievances against the West, where several generations of presidents, prime ministers, and secretaries of state have, according to Putin, let him down or ghosted him. After the interview, an incredulous Carlson held up a gray cardboard folder with a little rope tie. Putin had given him copies of documents to back up his historical claims. Yes, he did. So specifically, they were copies of letters being written by someone in Ukraine, or in the land that we now call Ukraine. So, I would recommend watching the interview. To suffice, in the area that is Ukraine, Poland controlled it in around 1654. Basically, Poland was trying to convert the population to become culturally Polish. So basically, it means bringing around Catholicism. That means making people speak Polish, overriding the Russian traditions that had been there for a long time. Anyhow, the leaders of the area were basically petitioning for Poland to give them rulers who would be Russian, who would be Eastern Orthodox. Anyhow, when Warsaw or Poland wouldn't listen to them, they started talking to Russia or Moscow, and that essentially led to a conflict in around 1654. But again, if you listen to the interview, you would know that. And Putin gave Carlson copies of those letters, basically proving that, hey, proving that that at a certain point in time, this land were people who were Russians who wanted Russian leaders. Now that's several hundred years ago. It's not today, but still, the fact that he made those claims is significant and should be considered. And Carlson even admitted that he thought it was filibustering. Well, I can't say that I thought that. It just felt like I also had the benefit of watching the interview where Carlson comes out and basically says, I thought it was filibustering, but it went somewhere. And it was a very long history lecture on that subject. See, what Putin saw when he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, here was an easy mark. Carlson meekly tried to interrupt Putin a couple of times to ask a question he seemed stuck on. Why hadn't all this history and these territorial issues come up with when Putin first became president in 2000? I wouldn't say it was meekly. He interrupted him, and, well, Putin... I have trouble being able to tell what Putin might have thought of that because, again, language differences, and there's a translator. But, again, Putin comes off as kind of arrogant and essentially winds up, basically saying, do you want to have a serious conversation or not? I mean, it's fairly arrogant in my opinion, but it's probably just... he's the one giving the interview. He doesn't have to do this, but he's choosing to do it, and he wants to spend his time talking about what he wants to talk about. So there's a bit of give and take here. So Putin wants to spend 30 minutes giving a history lesson on why he thinks these lands are Russian, then you're going to have to give him something on that matter. Let's see. Putin has a traffic in historical revisionism from the start and become increasingly obsessed with Ukraine after the Orange Revolution in 2004, and an easy one for Putin to ignore. It seemed to show that Carlson was less well briefed than Putin, who dropped biographical trivia about Carlson into the conversation, a trademark intimidation tactic of a KGB agent. Oh, yeah, he did his research. He's a former KGB guy. He wants to do research on who it is that he's talking to. Duh. I'm sure Carlson's smart enough to realize that, yeah, the former KGB guy who became president of Russia probably did his homework. He mentioned, for example, that Carlson had unsuccessfully tried to join the CIA. And thank God he didn't, because I think Carlson is a much better person for not being in that organization, because I view it as corrupt. Carlson didn't interrupt or challenge Putin on the too many to count occasions when Putin told falsehoods about the history of Ukraine. Well, he's not there to challenge him on everything. It's not a debate, it's an interview. He wants to hear Putin's argument. That is an interview. You're not, again, this isn't a debate. You're not supposed to interrupt on everything. If you want the conversation, you let the man talk. Alright. Yada, yada, yada. Basically complaints about the Minsk agreement and how Putin claimed that Kiev wasn't following its side of the deal. What Russian television viewers saw. Putin has reprised his history lecture many times. It seems likely that most Russians who watched the entire interview did so out of professional obligation. Their jobs as propagandists or political appointees is to amplify and affirm the leader's message. Ordinary Russians probably watched only outtakes and commentary. What they saw was that something momentous had happened. One of the most popular journalists in America came to interview Putin and looked like a deer in the headlights. Channel 1 stressed both Carlson's popularity and Americans' evident interest in what Putin had to say. Carlson's promotional video in advance of the interview itself had been watched more than 100 million times. Russians see Carlson, not unreasonably, as a representative of a future Trump administration, a preview of the coming America in which the liberals who support Ukraine are finally displaced. Gee, wouldn't that just be so bad? Well, it would be bad for them, because that's what they want. What Carlson's viewers saw... man. I'm done with this one. What did Putin gain from sitting down with Tucker Carlson? Russian leaders' interviews with former Fox News hosts meandered into an extended history lesson at times. So, yeah, because, again, history lesson, because he wants to justify his conflict. Whether you agree with him or not is immaterial. The fact is that he believes it enough, or he claims to believe it, and he's going to act as though he claims to believe it, so therefore you have to take his claims seriously. Why do you have to take his claims seriously? Because he has a military at his beck and call. He has nuclear weapons that he can use. You have to just not discount everything that he says, even if you disagree with him or think he's wrong. So the resulting back and forth, which began with an almost 25-minute monologue by Putin, yada yada, basically same deal, and Wall Street Journal wants to pay money, which we will not do. No. CNN Business, Putin walks away with propaganda victory after Tucker Carlson's softball interview. I wouldn't call it a propaganda victory. I mean, he got to... It's completely, in my opinion, unreasonably uncharitable to say that it's somehow this is all just propaganda. Like, Putin has his objectives, he wants to make his arguments. It's not that, I don't think it should be that big of a deal because we're not at war with Russia, right? So therefore all Carlson is doing is interviewing the leader of a country who's at war. The problem, though, is that that's not really the reality. The reality is the U.S. is kind of sort of at war with Russia because we keep funding and propping up Ukraine. If it weren't for that, Ukraine would have folded at this point years ago. It's more or less the United States using Ukraine as a proxy to go fight Russia, which is dumb in my opinion. I think it's wrong. I think if you're going to wind up doing that kind of thing, you at least need to vote from Congress. Like, again, war in all its forms should require Congress, unless the U.S. is directly attacked first, in which case I would give the president more authority to immediately respond to a situation. But seeing as Russia attacking Ukraine does not affect the U.S. unless, we decide to stick our nose in it, then I think that, if the U.S. wants to get involved, all House members and all Senate members should have to stand on the floor of Congress and give a vote. That can be recorded, and their constituents know, did you vote to send our money to Ukraine? Did you vote to get us involved in a conflict? In whatever capacity, to be honest. We'll go and scroll through the CNN article. It's evident now why Vladimir Putin granted an interview to Tucker Carlson. Over the course of more than the 2-hour sit-down, the former Fox News host turned online commentator largely refrained from challenging the Russian authoritarian, whose brutal war in Ukraine has led to needless deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Again, immediately out with the emotional language and the framing. I mean, let's be real. Ukraine's also used cluster munitions in this. That's like a war crime, basically, to a lot of countries. It's war. Neither side's happy about it, and Russia felt that the Minsk agreement wasn't being honored. Therefore, they felt compelled to step in. Again, you don't have to agree with it, but you should also try to be more objective like this. And you could always say, well, there's no such thing as true objective journalism, which I think is stupid. You could always say, like, if I was to tell you that, like, if I was to give you a news report on the weather, I can say it's raining or it's not raining, and that's completely objective. Is it raining right now where I am? That's the question, yes or no. Just give basic, simple information. Give it directly. Stop adding context and framing that makes you feel one way or the other. It's not a terribly complicated thing to do, but of course this is CNN. What can you expect? In some cases, Carlson even fed into Putin's narratives. For instance, Putin's advanced absurd deep state-style conspiracy theory that the U.S. government is not controlled by its elected leaders, but by unelected powers at the Central Intelligence Agency who direct the president like a puppet from the shadows. Yes, that was discussed. Basically, Putin said that he tried to come to agreements with American presidents before, and that on multiple times he either he would be rebuffed or his request would be go unanswered, and that would be because normally a communication with the CIA. So in some instances, it would be the CIA. He would ask the president a question, and the CIA would come to Putin and give Putin the response from a president, or it would be that Putin would ask something of the president. The president would then get back to Putin, and he would suspect the CIA basically told the president, hey, don't do it. And that's fair. I mean, these guys are unelected bureaucrats who essentially sit there for multiple terms, and they essentially have larger control over the foreign policy process than a lot of American presidents, in my opinion. I believe that is a problem, and that they should be brought to heel and made subservient to elected officials. That is the difference between having a government that's run by bureaucrats or a government that's run by the will of the people. At the very least, you should have to run for office at the CIA if you want to be able to have that kind of authority. Therefore, you still reflect the will of the people and not the will of an entrenched bureaucracy. And Carlson made the point in the interview. So twice you've described U.S. presidents making decisions and then being undercut by their agency heads, which is not a good look if the United States is not functioning the way it's supposed to be. It sounds more like, the people who are supposed to run the country aren't the ones running the country. I thought it was pretty interesting that this got brought up at the end of the interview. So Carlson makes an offer to Vladimir Putin. As a gesture of goodwill to the West and the United States, will you release this man named Evan Gershkovich into my custody, or into the custody of Tucker Carlson, and I can bring him back to the United States? Now, the reason why this man was arrested in the first place, according to the Russians, is that he was caught secretly obtaining classified information, and in Russia that's considered espionage, and so he's been arrested and imprisoned for it. Now, I don't know if it's true or not. It could be completely bogus. It could be completely true. I mean, you have a Wall Street Journal journalist that's abroad in Russia. Does the CIA tap him on the shoulder like, hey, while you're there digging, looking around for the story, perhaps you look exactly right here for some information for us and just pose as a journalist while also secretly obtaining this information. Entirely plausible in my opinion. Anyhow, Putin basically said, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to release this guy to you. I have trouble blaming him for that. I mean, there is a PR victory where if Putin had done this, then Carlson would return to America with this imprisoned journalist in his custody, setting him free. And that would make the interview 10 times bigger than what it is. Everyone would have to acknowledge it. And you couldn't claim that Carlson was some sort of a bad guy, or at least you'd have a hard time doing it, because he got a journalist out of prison from Russia. Instead, Putin said no, and I'm going to guess it's because he's already had one prisoner exchange, the Brittany Griner exchange deal, where he essentially got an arms dealer in return. I mean, which one is more effective for Putin? Probably the arms dealer, right? Very big deal. And he traded a celebrity that's a very replaceable value for that. So in his mind, he's probably thinking, try to go for another prisoner exchange swap, probably get someone more interesting. And that's the kind of the route he was more open to, rather than getting a PR victory. Hard to blame him because, again, PR doesn't seem to be a thing the Russians are great at, but they seem to be much better at military force and at apparently dealing with presidents that make stupid decisions. NPR, we'll finish on this one. Tucker Carlson, the fired Fox News star, makes bid for relevance with Putin interview, and it's headlines like this that just kind of bother me. Largely because he's still irrelevant. Like, these people are incredibly full of themselves. What is David Folkenflick? What are you thinking with this comment or with this headline? Like, Tucker Carlson has remained relevant with or without Fox News. Sure, Fox News helped him grow to what he became, but his name is still Tucker Carlson. He will always be Tucker Carlson wherever he goes with a phone that can, or wherever he goes with a camera that can upload to the internet. He'll probably be even more successful and more wealthy with his own show on Twitter than having to listen to Fox News. In fact, Fox News would probably try to prevent him from getting this kind of an interview. Whereas working for himself, he can interview whoever he wants. Yeah. That's about all I have for tonight. Don't want to drag this on longer than I have to. In any case, thanks for listening. Consider liking and subscribing. Have a good night, and enjoy the Super Bowl. Maybe people will talk about this a little bit. I highly recommend checking it out before then if you're going to be around family and those family are going to bring it up. Again, nothing wrong with listening to arguments made for yourself. Definitely do your own research. I'm not perfect. Putin has his own agenda. I wouldn't trust him. Carlson is a media figure who wants to boost his own celebrity, surely. But also, I think he's probably the most honest person when it comes to discussing this stuff. Anyhow, thanks, and bye.